Okay. So the topic du jour is advection and dispersion. What we've done so far in the class is look at various flow processes and diffusion. And so we'll be putting those together, and the flow processes will now be carrying mass, and that'll be advective transport. And there also will be some spreading and mixing. Diffusion will be part of that. There'll be also some other mechanical mixing, which we'll lump into this term that we call dispersion. And we'll be interested in transport of mass in various different ways and various different types of fluids. And I start with this is, I think, one of the more spectacular examples of transport, that more spectacular looking examples of transport of this plume from the volcano in Iceland. So there'll be a variety of scenarios that we'll be interested in analyzing using advection and dispersion. Plumes and jets are one example. And let's see, this is down here in the lower right. Here's an example of a plume, a contaminant plume in groundwater. And so in this case, we've got groundwater flow in this direction, and there's a source of contaminants, probably a couple of sources here. And this is just mass that gets introduced into the flow. And probably in this case, it's not really affecting the flow too much. It gets carried along like we see here. The color is the location of this plume. This is actually fairly large. It's about almost 3 miles from there to the river, so quite a large groundwater plume. And over here, this is something similar. This is a tracer, a fluorescent dye in a stream, and so it's mass of dye that's introduced in the stream, and it moves along with the flow, but it's really intended to just trace out the flow of the water itself. So it's moving along with the water, but it's also spreading out and mixing. And these other examples show more of a situation where fluid is carrying some mass, and it's injected at some velocity into another fluid. So here's the Grand River flows. It's up in Michigan, and so it's flowing along here, and it's got these dikes here that contain it, and then it forms this plume in Lake Michigan. And I don't know, can you see this color sufficient to see this plume that kind of spreads out like that? So the flow is coming out, and we're having spreading in this direction, and there'll be some spreading as well in that direction. So this jet that carries sediment mass into the Lake Michigan. And here's some other jets. These are hydrothermal vents. So fluid is flowing up through the seafloor and comes out, and there's a jet as it comes up and spreads out laterally. This is another picture of a jet up here, and this is actually just a jet of one fluid being injected into another fluid. There's not really any differences in the mass, but they use this special fluid that has these special optical properties, birefringent properties, that allows the flow pattern to be imaged. And you can see, I think, that there's this fairly complicated flow pattern with this is a turbulent jet, so that there are lots of eddies in here, and you can see the boundary of the jet right here, and there are these eddies that form along the boundaries that's causing mixing along the boundaries of the jet. So those are some kinds of flows that we might be interested in looking at advection and dispersion about. Now, there'll also be, so one of the things that will be key is with the dispersion process is mixing, and it'll allow the fluid to mix and have mass mixed within the flowing fluid. That'll form, that'll be important to controlling the concentration in the fluid. It'll also be important for causing reactions within the fluid. So there'll be a couple of ways that that's done in an engineering sense, where it's implemented in various structures. One of the simplest ways is with a static mixer, and this is a device that's designed to create dispersion by basically separating flow and separating flow paths and then bringing them back together. And so this is a picture of an inline mixer. This thing goes in a pipe, and you can see right there, it's basically a plate that's twisted and attached to another plate here that's twisted in a different direction. And so what happens as fluid moves along through here, these two particles get separated and they go different paths through these twisted plates, and they get separated and mixed. So you have flow going through a pipe, and it goes through this process this structure that separates the flow, and it comes out here mixed. Now, this is done also on larger scale, and this is an example that I don't know, many of you might know where this is. I hope that probably all of you appreciate that it's there, even if you don't know where it is. This is a Clemson wastewater treatment plant. The Madron Center is out here, and so this is Lake Hartwell, and this is where the wastewater gets treated. And so if we zoom in, there are various things that go on here, but if we zoom in right here, that looks like this. So the process, the wastewater treatment process goes on. There are a variety of things that happen, and at the end they put in some chlorine to disinfect the water, and they want to mix it in very thoroughly. So there's a big tank, and this is an aerial view, and here it is looking at it from perspective, and so there's a buildings, here's a person about that size. So pretty big structure, and what's happening here is that the flow is going along this kind of serpentine channel, and mixing is occurring during that process. Okay, so this is another example of a static mixer where you give where you induce mixing and allow a chemical reaction to take place. Now, we can also have active mixers where we put energy into the system with some kind of mechanical means. One way to do it is with an inductor, and here's a picture. This thing is a picture of an inductor. If you have flow that goes in like this, and it goes through, see, this is a little nozzle right here, and then there's an open space. So this is open right here, right to there. So this thing forms a jet that shoots out, and the jet is exposed right here. You have a very high velocity jet that creates suction, and so that pulls fluid in like this, and the jet that is injected fluid that's injected in this direction mixes with the fluid that gets pulled in here, and very high turbulence right in there, and so these two fluids then get mixed and ejected there. So sometimes these are used in tanks where you have a pump that pumps a fluid in like that, and it draws fluid in here and mixes them and injects it like that. So this tends to mix the entire tank, as well as causing this very high turbulence and mixing right there. So that's one way of mixing. Another way would be to have a shaft with some blades on it so that it spins around, and that also causes flow within this tank, as well as very high shear right here in the vicinity of these blades. And so that's that's an additional way to basically disturb this flow, cause a splitting of flow paths, and mixing in essentially an engineered dispersion process. Okay, so those are some examples. Let's get back to the process. So we've got two things going on here, diffusion and advection. This will be just a simple first cut. What we mean by advection is the mass that's transported just in the flowing fluid, so the flux of mass. This is something we've seen, I think, since the early days of the class. The mass flux from advection is just going to be the velocity or the volumetric flux of the fluid times the concentration. And so the way we can think of that conceptually is that if we have some flowing fluid, like I'm showing here, and we put a blob of mass in there, then that blob just moves along like so. Okay, so it's just simply translated along in the flow. And so that's advection if the flow is well, yeah, it's just tracking with the flow. Now diffusion is a process we've seen in class already. This is well, we can think of this as being step one for diffusion. We go a little bit longer time, and this would be time 2 and time 3 and time 4. So if we start with a circular mass and everything's stationary, then we have these different images of the concentration distribution at various different times. Okay, so that's the diffusion process, and here I show this this mass that's spread out at the end. This plot here is this would be the concentration profiles at different times through a point right there. Okay, so there's diffusion and advection, and then what I'm showing down here at the bottom would be a situation where we have flow. We start with this mass, and then we track this mass downstream. So it moves down here, and it takes some time to move from here to here, and during that time the diffusion process has taken place, and so it's spreading, and we move down here further, and it's spread even more. So we think of this now in terms of distance, that this blob of mass has traveled, and it's being advective downstream. If only advection was taking place, then we would have just this this mass that stays preserved, but diffusion is also taking place because of the elapsed time that has occurred to go travel along this path. Okay, so we've got these two processes superimposed, advection and diffusion, and that gives us this spreading in the flow. Okay, so we've really just combined what we saw last week with this advective process. Now we are also going to be interested in the process of dispersion. This is going to have a similar effect as diffusion, but it's conceptually different. So dispersion is going to be mixing that occurs as a result of flow processes. And there'll be a couple of things that can cause this. We can have gradients in the flow velocity. So if the flow changes spatially, then that will cause mixing. We can have that happen under laminar conditions and under turbulence. And we can also have splitting of flow paths. So we can have flow paths that diverge and come back together. That will also cause mixing, and that will also be a form of dispersion. So here's an example of a gradient in flow velocity. So this is a conduit, imagine this is a tube or a slot, and this is the wall right here. So the velocity profile, let's just say it's laminar flow, the velocity profile is going to be looking like that. Largest velocity will be in the center, and the velocity will go to 0 at the walls. And so you can imagine then if we have two particles here that start out at next to one another, this one that's closer to the center will be in a higher velocity flow than the one that's closer to the wall, and so they'll tend to get separated. So there would be, this particle would be here, and this particle would be here. Okay? So that's a dispersion process where they're separated longitudinally as a result of this difference in it's basically a gradient in the flow direction perpendicular to the direction of flow. So it's a result of the shear that results from these different velocities. Now, one thing that happens is that you'll have this zone here. If we imagine this is like a concentration, a uniform concentration, then after we go downstream, then the higher concentration zone looks like that. Well, what will happen when this occurs is that you'll have a concentration gradient here, so you'll have diffusion that responds to this concentration gradient, and that'll cause some spreading like this. So there'll be diffusion that happens if the time scale is long enough and relative to the length scale, that tends to spread this out a little bit and tends to kind of smooth out some of this dispersion. And so instead of having a set of particles that are arranged like I show here with this parabolic profile, you might expect that it looks more like this, where this steep front here is rounded out a little bit as a result of local diffusion. In any case, what we get here is that this velocity gradient gives a spreading in the direction of the flow, and we'll recognize this as the longitudinal dispersion. The rate at which it happens will depend on the velocity of the flow. Okay, so another way that we can have dispersion is from splitting of flow paths, and there'll be a couple of ways that this could happen. Let's think at first of flows that are in porous media. I think that's probably easiest to visualize, and so we have flow paths that go like this, and the other one that goes along like that, and the splitting here occurs because the flow has to go around a grain. So we have two particles that start out as neighbors, and then they go along these paths, and they end up like that. And so they're separated in a direction that's perpendicular to the average flow. So this is transverse dispersion, spreading perpendicular to the flow direction. We could also envision some other configuration of the flow paths that might look like this, in which case these guys are now separated like this in a longitudinal direction. So the splitting of the flow paths causes some longitudinal dispersion as well. Okay, so that's, I think, easy to visualize with porous media. With turbulence, we have something similar going on, except these things here, instead of being grains, these are these turbulent eddies. So we have particles that are neighboring, and they split, and we have transverse dispersion and longitudinal dispersion that happens as a result of the interaction with these eddies that are causing mixing. Okay, so this is kind of idealized. This is a photomicrograph. So we did this work with basically analyzing flow in small microfluidic cells. We just looked at circular regions or circular grains. This is a photomicrograph that's formed from created from photomicrograph from a slide of a thin section from a rock. And so we'll be interested then in looking at the flow that occurs well, basically the flow is like this. We specify the head along this side and the head along this side as a uniform head on these two boundaries, and that induces flow through this. Yeah, this is actually an example in COMSOL, so you guys can, if you search through the examples, you can see this. And let's see, I'm going to show you a video of this. So here's some transport of some mass that's put in at the lower right, and you can see as it moves through this media, the head gradient is uniform. It's uniform head on one side, uniform head gradient. The applied head gradient is uniform, but you can see we get a great deal of spreading both in the direction perpendicular to flow as well as parallel to flow. You can see we're getting a little bit of breakthrough right here in the lower left-hand corner, but we're having spreading up here in the upwards towards the top of the cell. Okay, so there's an example of transverse and longitudinal dispersion in a material that is a little more realistic than just the circular grains that we saw earlier. And so, yeah, here's just another comment about this turbulent dispersion. We saw this example where we've got some turbulent eddies formed, and here's the eddy structure, and we've got this forming mixing, which is causing dispersion in both of these directions. And so the way we might think about this is that the dispersion process in porous media, it's going to depend on how fast the velocity through the pores is, but it also is going to depend on how big the grains are, right? Because if it's splitting, going around the grains, that'll be an important scale. If the grains are bigger, then it has to split around, go around those bigger grains, then it'll spread further. And then similarly here, in turbulence, we've got these turbulent eddies occurring over a whole range of sizes. The bigger the eddy, the broader region, or the longer the path of spreading or dispersion will be. Okay, so we would expect then that turbulent dispersion process depend on the velocity within these eddies as well as their size. And in particular, the largest size of the eddy will give us the largest spreading. Okay, so that's kind of those are the concepts that emerge from these sketches. So what I want to do is introduce this concept of a dispersive flux, where we've got this is a mass flux, and it depends on a concentration gradient. And there'll be a dispersion constant here. And in Weasley, we've got two formulas that have the same form, but the dispersion here, the dispersion constant is a bit different. So this is how we're going to treat dispersion. The dispersion constant is given here, and it's going to include these concepts that came out of the previous discussion. So this dispersion constant, it's going to have the same units as diffusivity. So the units will be L squared over time, because this thing looks a lot like Fick's law, where we have a mass flux proportional to a concentration gradient. That would be the diffusivity. So this thing has units of length squared per time, and it's going to be equal to some kind of a constant, and this is the flux, and that's some kind of length that has to do with the problem. it's turbulent, then maybe it's the size of the eddies. If it's the porous media, if it's a small scale porous media problem, then it's maybe the size of the grains. If it's a larger porous media problem, then maybe it's the size of larger scale heterogeneities in the porous media. But anyway, the take-home thing here is that we've got this quantity that's controlling dispersion, and it's going to depend on the velocity of the flow and some kind of length scale over which the mixing is taking place. So seems to make sense. Okay, so we want to go and come up with the analysis that we've been using. So let's see, we've got the divergence of the flux plus the rate of change of storage is equal to some kind of source. So for this problem, we're going to use the conservation of mass, and so this will be the mass. That's what's getting conserved. So the dependent variable will be the mass per volume, and we can do it at first by just saying that we just have a continuous body of water. If we want to make it porous media, it'll be the mass per volume of porous media, so we'll include porosity. Maybe you have to also include the degree of saturation in there, but that'll be, I think, a straightforward next step. So if we say that we're conserving mass, cap theta is mass, and then little c is given here. Little c is the mass per volume, and that's just going to be cap c. And if it's all fluid, this would just be like the aqueous concentration. Okay, so the storage term, it's given here, just the rate of change of the concentration. And now the flux, we've got advection and diffusion and dispersion. Well, we've got advective flux and a diffusive flux. And so the advective flux, that's just going to be the flux from the fluid flow times the concentration. And now we're going to have two kinds of flux that are diffusive-like. One is the actual diffusion, and the other is from dispersion. So we'll call it from like a mechanical dispersion. Okay, well, this is, let's call this D sub, well, I call it, it's just D here, we'll call it D from diffusion, and this is from dispersion. Let's call it just let's call it mechanical dispersion. So just the mixing that we've been talking about from the separation. Okay, well, now we have two processes that govern these things. The Fick's law is just going to be giving us that the D from diffusion is minus D star, the diffusion constant, del C. And what we just had on the previous slide was dispersive flux, the mechanical dispersion. That's minus D mechanical times del C. Well, actually, let me change this. This is a little bit confusing because of all the D's. This should be a mass flux. So I was using J's before for mass flux. So let's call it J for diffusion and J for mechanical dispersion. And these guys will be J's. And then right there, those are J's. Okay? So then what we're going to do is substitute in, this stuff goes in there, and we've got the this term really has two components of it. We've got, let's do it like this. So we've got, I'm gonna give me a little bit more room by zooming in. So there's D, and that's gonna be minus D star. That's the diffusion, and then the mechanical dispersion is that. They're both proportional to the gradient of C, minus the gradient of C. So we can have this minus okay. So we can then lump that together into what we'll call the hydrodynamic dispersion. Okay, so now we've got our terms. What I'm going to do is say for now the source term is equal to 0. So the source, remember a couple of weeks ago we just focused on the source term. That was where we were having chemical reactions take place. So let's for now leave that alone. We'll get back to it soon enough, but let's just set that equal to 0 for now. And so now we can go and do the substitution where we say, okay, the divergence of our flux, this is going to be minus D star plus dm C. There's the diffusive flux, and then we've got an advective flux, which will be Q C. And all of that comes inside there. And then we've got the change in storage, and that equals 0. Okay, so there's the equation for advection and dispersion. This does dispersion, and we see that it's got a component from diffusion and a component from this mechanical dispersion process from the fluid flow mixing. And in both cases, they're multiplied by the gradient and the concentration. Then here's our advective flux, and all of these things here, this is the mass flux that we're interested in, and we do the divergence of that. Okay, so that's going to be our governing equation. Now, in order to solve this guy, actually, so I see here I have a little bit of a different version of this. If these guys here, if those guys are uniform, and if we lump them together and just call that dispersion, and if it's uniform, then it comes out here as D, and we'll have it just come out here as minus D. And then we have this divergence operator. This divergence operates on this guy, and we get a second derivative. Okay, and then the divergence operates on the advective flux, and we get this expression here. Okay, so that's the governing equation for dispersion being uniform, so kind of a simplified case. Now, in order to solve this, we need to have some boundary conditions. So there'll be 3 types in general. The first type is going to be fairly simple, where we specify the dependent variable, which is C. So we're going to specify the concentration on the boundary. And then the second type will be specifying some fluxes. So the simplest way, I think, is to just specify what the mass flux is at the boundary. So we could say there's no mass flux across the boundary. That would be like a no flow condition on a vessel. We can't have anything passing through that. And so typically the way we're going to express that is that the the mass flux normal to the boundary is equal to 0. We might also specify what the mass flux is. If we wanted to inject some mass into a region, and we knew what the mass flux that we wanted to inject was, then we could specify that on a boundary. Now, there's another thing we want to do is we want to get mass out of the region, and so if we've got a region like this, and there's some mass here, and it's flowing like that, well, if we let it go long enough, it's going to leave the region, right? If we have an overall flow like that, and so in order to do that, we have to just have the mass go out of the region as it would go. We don't want to impose something about what the mass flux is or what the concentration is. So we can't really use an effective boundary condition or a specified concentration boundary. And what we do, though, is we say, well, the diffusive flux at this boundary is going to be 0, and that's assuming that it's dominated by advection. So if we have some flow and we're just allowing it to advect out, and that's really the dominant process, then we say, well, the diffusion across that boundary is 0. That's the boundary condition. That's called an outflow boundary, and so that'll be when you go to set up your models in COMSOL, that's what COMSOL calls it. But what it's doing is specifying the diffusion flux is equal to 0. And so it'll be important to have that. If you have flow that's carrying mass and it tries to get out, and you don't have a boundary condition that lets it get out, then the model will have problems. Probably it will crash. And then we can also have this third type of boundary condition where the mass flux, this is the mass flux for diffusion now, is going to be proportional to the concentration. And this is used for if we had, say, had a region like this, and we've got a thin layer here that is impeding the diffusion outwards, then we might characterize the diffusion. This is like a mass transfer expression here, and so we might characterize the mass transfer out using this third type. Okay, so in order to set up these problems, we need to be able to specify the mechanical dispersion constant. We saw that it's going to be proportional to the velocity and some length scale. In a simple flow, we might just have uniform dispersion, but typically the dispersion is going to vary in the different directions. It'll be different in the direction of the flow than it is perpendicular to flow. This gives rise to a mechanical dispersion tensor, and here's for a 2D case, here's the 4 terms in the dispersion tensor, and here's how they are written. This is a little bit peculiar, but this is the x component of the velocity, and that's the y component of the velocity, and that's the absolute. This is basically the magnitude of the velocity, the absolute magnitude, and so this divides each one of these terms. So we can think of this as that term there. That's the longitudinal dispersivity that has units of length, and then this thing here, that's this u. This is the component of the velocity in the x direction divided by the average velocity. So this has got units of length. This has got units of velocity, or units of length per time. When we take that squared and divide it by that thing. Okay? So this is consistent with how we're thinking about it. We've got a component of longitudinal and a component of that's the transverse dispersivity. So these alpha L and alpha sub L and alpha sub T are allowing us to account for longitudinal and transverse dispersivity, and we're multiplying them by the velocities in the appropriate direction. Okay, so this is one way to develop the dispersivities. There are some other formulations available. This is probably the most common one that you see for developing the dispersivity or dispersion tensor. Okay, so let's now take a look at a plume in 1D. So we've got just a uniform flow, and then we've got a little source right here of mass, and as the flow goes through that, it dissolves out the mass, and then we produce a plume that looks like this. And so what you can see is that it's spreading. So the width starts out that. Let's zoom in. So there's the size of the source right there. And you can see though that it's as we have the flow is just all is just the x component in the flow, and we have this the spreading effect that is caused by dispersion. Okay, there's spreading in the transverse direction. There's also spreading in longitudinal direction that's more difficult to see, but that's another thing that is responsible for the decrease in the concentration as we go downstream. So what we've got here then is a process of advection that's taking the mass downstream, and a process of dispersion that's causing it to spread out. So what we want to do is, and I think a reasonable question to ask is, what's the relative importance of the advective process and the dispersion process? And so one good way to characterize that is using the Peclet number. And so what we can say is that, well, the time scale for advective transport is going to be, the velocity of advective transport is just v. So the time scale for advective transport is going to be the travel distance or some kind of characteristic length divided by the velocity. So this guy here, that's the time scale where advection is going to be important. Now we saw for diffusion the time scale. We saw for homework this week that the time scale for diffusion is going to be the characteristic length divided by whatever d is. Okay, so one way that we might be able to evaluate the relative importance of advection and diffusion or dispersion is to take the ratio of these time scales. So if we do that, then we have L over V. That's the time scale for flow or for the advection, and the diffusion is L squared, or I guess actually we should do it the other way. So yeah, we have the time for diffusion, which is L squared over D, divided by the time for flow, which is L over V, and so that gives us LV over D. Okay, and that's then the Peclet number. So I think you can see that as velocity gets bigger, then the Peclet number gets bigger and advection gets more important. As d gets bigger, then Peclet number gets smaller, and so for a large Peclet number is dominated by advection, small one is dominated by diffusion or dispersion, depending upon how we have this set up. Now, this gives us really just kind of a general way to think about things, because it doesn't really say, for example, what L should be. L is a characteristic length for the problem, and so it really depends on the problem, depends on what the setup is. D, I think it's easiest to think about this maybe in terms of just diffusion, but dispersion in our governing equation, dispersion is working the same as diffusion. So we could also have this D be, it could be just molecular diffusion, or it could be this hydrodynamic dispersion that includes the mechanical dispersive effects as well as the diffusion of mass. Okay, so here's an experiment that was done to take a look at this, and let's see. Well, here's the experimental setup. This is a little microfluidic cell, and so these are small little pores here, and here's the scale. These are ports where you could inject some dyes, and it's a small cell, but it's pretty big as microfluidic cells go. And so they put this on a light source and are able to image it. And so basically what's done is to have different velocities of flow sweeping across the cell, and then that will allow you to control what the Peclet number is. And so here, so Peclet number, there it is. It gets bigger with advection. So here, this would be a small Peclet number, and the mass is put in here. I don't know. I can see it's looking kind of like this, and then I kind of lose it. That's what the plume looks like in the experiment. So a small Peclet number, and then looks more like this. So that's a little bit bigger. A little bit bigger here. And so, and like so. So there you go. And what you're seeing then is this is low Peclet, high Peclet. So see the effect of spreading on basically the effect of the change in the Peclet number on the spreading. The other thing that they were interested in doing is characterizing the how spreading was occurring as a result of basically looking at the effect of dispersion on the spreading rate. So here's a profile, and if we inject and say, well, right at the source we've got a concentration profile that looks like that. As we move down, so maybe like right here, we've got a concentration profile that looks like that. As we move downstream, then it spreads out like I show here. And the width of this of the plume, we can think of that as sigma. And what these guys showed experimentally is that the dispersion is proportional to the rate of change of the width of the plume squared with time. Okay, so that thing is a length, and so the rate of change of the length squared, the width of the plume with time is going to be proportional to d. This, you can show theoretically that this is how it should work, and they were able to then confirm that experimentally. Okay, so the Peclet number can be written for diffusion as well as for dispersion. The relative important, one of the things that this does is it gives us a way to characterize, well, one of the things we need to be aware of is when the different contributions will be, or the different terms will be important. So what's shown here is the ratio of the dispersion constant, the longitudinal dispersion, to the molecular diffusion coefficient. And what's shown here is the Peclet number. And this is written, though, where D, the characteristic length, is the diameter of the grains, and D sub D is the diffusion constant. Okay, so this is kind of a very small scale Peclet number, where you've got really right at the pore scale for both the length scale and for D. And so what this is showing you is, then we can do some experiments and do some analysis, and this allows you to say, well, okay, what is the range where diffusion is important and basically dominates, and what is the range where dispersion is important? And this is what is shown here. So at about 0.01, Peclet number of 0.01, at values less than that, it's diffusion. At values greater than about 10, then it's going to be dispersion that is controlling, and then there's some kind of middle ground here. Okay, so that's the result that you get for Peclet number defined in this way. Up here, and where the dispersion is controlling, then maybe you would want to consider using a Peclet number that was based on the dispersion constant. Okay, so here's another kind of Peclet number. This is one where the velocity is the same that we've seen. D, this is just D in the advection dispersion equation. The way we wrote it, we had molecular diffusion and the dispersion constant added together. So we lump those together and say, well, that's just hydrodynamic dispersion. We're just going to call it D, and it'll have contributions from both. And then this guy here, this characteristic length, this is the mesh size. And so this then becomes a Peclet number that's defined, it's really tied to the numerical setup of the problem, because it's using the mesh size, the finite element size, as the characteristic length. And this ends up being important because the advection dispersion problem or equation is difficult to solve. It has numerical problems. It causes numerical problems, and in particular, it causes numerical problems as the Peclet number gets larger. And a typical characteristic of this is that if you have a step in the concentration, that this will end up causing some, instead of the concentration being represented like this, it kind of gets ripply like that. And when advection is high, well, what happens is diffusion or dispersion tends to smooth out a step like that. And so if you don't have anything to smooth it out, then there can be numerical problems. And you end up getting ripples, you can end up getting oscillations, you can end up getting instabilities where the concentration just gets to be, just explodes, and the problem doesn't converge. And so that is, basically the numerical Peclet number, or the mesh Peclet number, gives you a way to take a look at this. And if you have problems with transport problems, you may end up, you can plot this cell Peclet number, and the areas or the cell Peclet numbers where you start to get into problems, it really depends on the solver and how it's set up. But in a lot of cases, if the Peclet number, the cell Peclet number gets to be greater than 10 or 100, you'll start to have these peculiar effects. So keep an eye out for that, and it's a good reason to kind of put in your judgment as a filter in your results. Just because you get say these ripples in the results doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening. It may be this instability, and this also gives you a way to see how you might move forward. So if this is the criteria that you have to meet, well, how do you reduce the cell Peclet number? There are two options. I mean, the velocity, this probably isn't an option because that's part of that's the flow field that you're interested in. So either you can increase the dispersion or you can decrease the mesh size. So in some cases, you may be able to justify increasing the dispersion a little bit. That'll cause things to spread out a bit, but depending upon the problem, that it may be okay. If that's not really viable, and there certainly are reasons why you wouldn't want to do that because you're really changing the problem, then a path forward is to reduce the mesh size. I mean, that can then end up stabilizing the problem. You end up having the runtime increase, though, and that may be a difficulty. So, it's all going to be a trade-off, but I guess the important message is that this Peclet number can be used to characterize the physical aspects of the problem, but also it's important for some of the numerical aspects. Okay, so let's take a look at flow in channels. We saw this earlier. We had this spreading or this dispersion from flow from gradients on the velocity. This is a process called Taylor dispersion. We also may have dispersion just as a result of these turbulent eddies. So here are these little turbulent eddies that will cause some dispersion and in mixing. So the turbulent dispersion process, we saw dispersion in porous media. It was that velocity squared times dispersivity, some kind of characteristic length divided by the average velocity. In turbulent flows, then we have a flux that has this same kind of form, and we might expect then that the dispersion constant, it's got a characteristic length and a characteristic velocity. And we might expect then that this characteristic length is the diameter of this turbulent vortex, this guy. So that would be what we might think about as being d. And the velocity is this flow velocity here in the vortex. So probably related to the overall average velocity of the flow, but perhaps somewhat different from that. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that we would expect to be in the dispersion constant for turbulent flow. Now, let me show you how this works. So remember when we looked at turbulence and we said, well, the way we're going to characterize turbulent flow is with an average component and then a variation that's the variation caused by the turbulent eddy. And that was what we used to get the Reynolds stresses, and that's what we used to analyze the turbulent flow. Well, for transport in turbulent flow, we can think about it as the same way. So the velocity of the flow, it's got an average velocity and then a deviation from average from this vortex. the concentration, it also has an average value and some variation from average from this vortex. Okay, so here's a case where we just have one-dimensional flow. So the velocity is only in the x direction. Yeah, and actually that reminds me. Let me point this out, that this equation here, this is a 1D an equation for advection in a 1D flow. But in order to solve this problem, we need to know about the flow. So all the problems that we've looked at so far have really just been kind of contained under themselves. The flow processes, the diffusion process. But now we have a process where we need to know about the flow. And if it's a very simple situation where the flow is uniform, we can just specify what it is. But if it's a more complicated flow, then we're going to need to solve for this separately. So we really think of this problem then in a general sense as having two governing equations, one that governs the concentration and the other that would govern the flow. Okay? And if the concentration is very dilute, then maybe we can solve the flow problem first, and we just assume that the mass is moving along with the flow, and we don't really need to resolve the flow problem. So this term right here would result from an analysis like what we did in the earlier part of the class. The simplest case, and what we'll do for this week, is just assume that we can solve it in a sequence, solve the velocity first and then import it and use it. But if you think about it, the concentration may actually change the velocity. So if the concentration, for example, is high enough to change the density, then we would need to include that as we basically solve the two equations simultaneously. Okay, so for the turbulent flow problem, here's the way that it works. This is our governing equation, and each one of these terms here is got an average component and a deviation. So in this case, I substituted in, so here's the average, here's the deviation, and so it's just a basic substitution of the stuff that I have over here. And now I multiply all this stuff out, right, and kind of pull it apart, and everything in red ends up being this guy here. This is the second derivative of the averaged perturbed concentration. So the way that it works is if we take the average of this perturbed concentration or the perturbed velocity, it averages out to 0. So all the terms here these all go to 0 because we're just averaging out a perturbed quantity. And what you're left with after you cancel out and then rearrange it, and what you're left with is this. This is the regular advection diffusion equation, the same equation that we had. You end up with these two new terms here. It's these guys here, and it comes from multiplying that times that, and that times that. Okay? So you can work through it and see how it goes, but you end up then with the regular diffusion, regular advection dispersion equation, these two extra terms. But what we said was that is that's the mass transfer from dispersion in a turbulent flow. So that's that guy. We can then substitute these expressions in there. And when we do that, we get a derivative of this little guy here, basically the derivative of that, and substitute it in. And if the dispersion is uniform, it comes out and it gives us that guy there. So this is dispersion, turbulent dispersion, second derivative of the concentration. That's the same thing that we get from from the dispersion that we saw earlier, same thing we get from, same kind of form that we get from diffusion. So these guys end up giving us terms that look like that, and then we rearrange it and we get this. So here's the source, here's the change in concentration. There's diffusion, there's dispersion in turbulence, and in X and in Y, and then there's the advective term. Okay? So for turbulent flow, we end up with an expression that's the same advective dispersion equation, except now the dispersion coefficient ends up including the effects of mixing in a turbulent, by these turbulent eddies. So this is important because it'll allow us to look at flows and transports in fluids that have turbulence in them. We say, well, we're going to ignore a certain eddy size, and we're just going to take we're not going to solve for that explicitly. We're just going to take the mixing that causes and embed it in this dispersion term. Okay, that's the approach, and we'll try some problems that involve this kind of analysis for homework. All right, that's all.